Yeah, the party is on. In the party zone. Yeah, the party is on. In the party zone. Yeah, the party zone. What's up, party people? It's the Party Zone Podcast, a podcast about all things party. I'm your host, Chad, and in this episode, I talked with Syrus Marcus Ware, a total powerhouse. They're an activist, scholar, visual artist, and DJ, and as a core team member of Black Lives Matter Toronto, they're on the front lines of the most important social issue of our time, equality. They're an organizer of Blockorama, the longest running and largest stage at Pride Toronto, comprised mainly of Black, queer, and trans-identifying people. And of course, they're educated, bachelors, masters, in the progress of finishing a PhD, 4 letters for Syrus, SMRT. This is a super interesting episode. We cover everything from why we don't need police or security at festivals, and how to have the hard conversations that need to take their place, why the dance floor is essential to revolution, how to plan a proper party, and even what parties might look like in 2070. This was a really important conversation for me as I continue my education on white privilege and Black history through the lens of party and dance music. So I think you're going to enjoy this one. If a lot of this is new to you, we've compiled some thorough show notes for you to binge dive on right after. Now, I pulled a total Chad here and didn't press record on the first few minutes, so I'm going to catch you up. First, there was an anecdote. In 2016, Black Lives Matter Toronto led the Pride Parade, and in front of 2 million people stopped for half an hour as they held a sit-in, protesting the imbalance of inclusivity, issues around accessibility, and the amount of police presence at the parade. They held a list of demands for the organizers and did not move until it was signed. And what's extra badass is that this was the first time a Canadian Prime Minister marched in the parade, so that pause was extra significant. Now, it took time to actually make those changes, but change was made, and that's the point. And so we pick up as Syrus is explaining that the Pride Parade essentially began as a protest march against police brutality towards the gay community in Toronto, notably after the violent and brutal bathhouse raids in 1981. So pull up a chair and take notes. Class is in session.
Party zone. It grew out of activism. Pride grew out of activism. It grew out of this groundswell of people who said, we're actually tired of the police kicking in our doors. We're saying enough of that. And so, when you look to what Pride has gone on to become, it was something that, people were able to push for a lot of rights, a lot of changes in our society, under the banner of coming together under queer pride, and there's a lot of great things that came out of, Pride Toronto as an organization and the festival initially. But quickly, after, 10 or 15 years, people started recognizing that there were still a lot of gaps in the festival. There wasn't a lot of diversity. There wasn't a lot of spaces for youth. There wasn't a lot of disability focused programming or accessible programming for deaf and hard of hearing folks. Like there were issues with Pride. And so, the desire by groups like Black Lives Matter Toronto to come together and say, actually, can we address some of these structural issues, brings us back to this origin of saying, actually, when we were fighting against the bathhouse raids, we were fighting for all of us. A lot of the people who were found in the houses were racialized people. There's a huge community of racialized people who were queer and trans and who were arrested as part of that. And so why are these people not represented in the festival that is now commemorating that attack, right? So, groups like Blockorama and Blackness Yes, BQI, they've been doing this work for 22 years. Blockorama has been around, trying to address the way that anti-Blackness was playing out at the festival. So absolutely, Pride is still a protest. I mean, the dance floor, the parade, the parks where people gather. These are community spaces. These are activist spaces. These are revolutionary spaces. These are places where we meet the people that we're going to organize with for the next 20 years. They're the places where we meet our lovers. They're the places where we make our families. It's absolutely a revolutionary space.
That's so powerful, and raises the question for me is how can, if these are safe spaces for the community, how can the community keep them safe without the supposed help of police is there a role for security, for example, or is there a difference?
I've been going to Pride since 1996, and the only times that I've ever seen real violence happen has been at the hands of the police. So I've seen them put their hands on people who they think are street involved or homeless, who they assume are up to no good or shouldn't be at the festival. I've seen them put their hands on people who are intoxicated and inebriated, who probably just need to let go, have a sit down and have some water, not be roughed around, I've seen them sort of put their hands on people and escalate situations, and that sort of creates drama. That's what I've witnessed. I haven't seen a lot of other issues. I think that at a festival this large, where there is 2 million people, we need to have supports around to make sure that we keep each other safe. So what that could look like would be to have harm reduction workers going around and making sure that everybody has supplies to be able to, if they're going to be using drugs, to do it safely, that there's naloxone, that there's, people who know how to use that medication in order to save lives. There could be community accountability or community teams that are going around and making sure that everybody has what they need and that they're feeling safe and that they are protected and that they're not being bothered by or harassed by other people in the community. So there can be supports for people who are going through mental health or emotional crises, because going to Pride can be a very emotional time for a lot of people. People also can be reminded of maybe being cut off from connection or not feeling supported. There's often a spike in suicides around Pride, so we have to really recognize that it can be an emotional time. We could have community-led crisis support teams for people who are in mental health crisis. None of the things that I've mentioned require police. None of the things that I mentioned require a uniformed officer with a gun and a taser coming in to fix those situations. When you think about adding a uniformed officer with a gun and a taser and a squad car and a whoop, 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 just thinking about it is sort of laughable. Why would you bring that into a situation that was already tense? Because, of course, all it does is amp up the tension and make things much more complicated. So I think that we could create community-led supports that make sure that we keep each other safe, and I think that when people come to Pride, there are things that we can do to make sure that everybody has what they need to be safe: water, food, support, just what you do when you're planning a good party.
Well, let's talk about that. What are the key ingredients? I mean, you were so involved with Blockorama. Like, what are the ingredients for you for the party?
Yeah, I think it's so important to make sure that we're thinking about access. So when we're having a party in 2020, it's not good enough to not think about access. So, thinking about, whether or not, if you have someone speaking on stage, do you have ASL interpretation? Do you have a disability viewing area where people can kind of see and access the stage, above a crowd, so that if somebody is seated sort of most of the time that they're at the party, they can still sort of see and kind of engage in the space. Having harm reduction supplies and have a harm reduction space, a chill out zone. In a party where you have 15 to 20,000 people, you need to make sure that you have a chill out space, that you have harm reduction supplies, that you have naloxone, so that you can kind of make a space for people. I can think about a time at Blockorama where, again, Pride security was putting their gloves on because they were about to put their hands on somebody who was really just going through an emotional time. They were going through an emotional time. They were definitely inebriated, but they were going through an emotional time. Pride is it can be a really emotional moment for somebody. And what this person needed was some water. They needed to use the bathroom, and they needed to sit down and just chill out for a minute. But at that point, we hadn't yet created the chill out space that is now a cornerstone of our programming. So that was the year that we were like, oh, that's what we, because otherwise without that, the person is sort of panicked and kind of freaking out, and security comes in, and then it becomes a problem, right? So I think having a harm reduction and chill out space is really essential. And then making sure that you kind of are, thinking through all the people who might be coming. Is this a space for families? Is this not a space for families? Is this a space where there's going to be a variety of different kinds of music playing? We are a space that is for Black queer and trans people. It's a Black affirming space, but that means that we want to make sure that we're, representing the entire diaspora, so that there's music and there's artists from the continent. There are folks, sort of talking about Blackness in America. There are, folks, Nova Scotians, sort of coming in and Afro-Indigenous artists, and just making sure that we're really telling a full story of Blackness. I think that makes for a really great party. It makes for a really diverse party. And yeah, those are some of the things that I think about.
When you're at a party, what is your party state? Like, are you sort of like the party starter, or are you like the caretaker? Are you like encouraging people? Like, what's your party mode?
I definitely used to be the party planner. I loved to plan parties. I loved to have parties. My parents were the kind of people who often they were artists, and so they would often have these theme parties, like where were you in 62, or, different things. Well, it was in the 80s, but anyways, so they would like have these sort of theme parties. And so I used to have theme parties, and I used to really enjoy it. I think now I'm a DJ, so I often like to be the DJ at the party. I think being the DJ is a really special kind of role that feels like an honor to get to do, because you're sort of maybe making the night work for people or not, so it's a lot of pressure sometimes, but it can be really beautiful. And you also get to see the party in a different way, because you're often in a place that's just set aside from other people. And so you kind of have a vantage point on the whole party in a way that you don't really from any other place, so it's also a really beautiful way to just watch people experiencing joy, Black joy, queer joy, trans joy, just, it can be really beautiful. I think, and then I would think that if I'm just sort of on the town with my friends, sort of, hanging out, I definitely think that I am a healthy dose of party starter and caretaker, because I'm often the person who's like, does everybody have enough water, and making sure that we're all, sort of taking care of ourselves.
More people need to think that phrase. Does everybody have enough water?
Does everybody have enough water?
That reflects back on your story of that incident at Blockorama, where what that person needed was water and to sit down. They didn't need to be, taken away or anything.
Exactly. And of course, like for a queer person who's experienced trauma in their life, and they finally find this homecoming where there's, I don't know, like just people tell their stories about the first time they go to Blockorama, and everybody has their story. And it's like, you come around the corner and you're one person, and then suddenly you're in a sea of thousands of Black, queer, and trans people. Like, it is incredible to be seen and to see yourself reflected in that way. So for this Black, queer young person who is like kind of going through a tough time, and they've come home to Blockorama, they finally found this community, and that's part of what was bringing up all the feelings. What they needed was some water and to sit down. And can you imagine what would have happened if they had been kicked out, right? Because of course that sense of abandonment, that sense of being shut out, that sense of isolation would just come crashing down on them, and of course make things so much worse. And who knows what would have happened after that, right? So we were able to interrupt that, and we recognized that our work had to be to continue to interrupt those processes to make sure that everybody got to be able to be home, in the party space. Wow,
that's so powerful, and I think anybody who has felt like an outsider in any form, from a Black trans person to a punk kid in the middle of Ohio, everyone's looking for their community, and to be able to curate that community is such a powerful thing, and honorable work, as you say. You spoke about this in a piece, and I'd love to hear your take on it, whether it's fresh or whether you remain the same on it. The dance floor is essential to revolution. What does this mean to you, and how can we take some insight from that into our party habits?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the dance floor is where, as I say, it's where we meet our comrades. It's where we meet fellow activists. It's where we meet our lovers. It's where we meet our future family. It is this essential space. It's always been a space that has been central to revolution. I think about the sort of revolutionary artists who have made practices that are about sort of activist organizing, like Adrienne Piper and her funk lessons, where she was sort of teaching people funk as a way of addressing white supremacy within her art school. I think about some of the sort of incredible kind of party spaces that have been created in cities where there have been massive uprisings. I think about Wattstack, which was this sort of Black Woodstock, or the Harlem Music Festival, which was also like a Black Woodstock that happened in 1969, both of them in 1969 and 1970 respectively, and about how those were spaces for people to come together, be in this part of this Black revolutionary movement, but also celebrate and dance and just be together. I think about how many early HIV and AIDS activists were also DJs. We're also party people. We're also organizers. We're also part of building queer dance floors and queer dance spaces, and how they continue to do so. And I think this has always been a revolutionary space. And I think this I was at a Black queer conference maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and there was an elder there who had been around and going to queer bars in the 40s and 50s. And he talked about how there was this light switch code, where the bouncer downstairs would sort of flick a light switch that would go on upstairs, and that would be, to let you know that the police were coming, so people could switch partners, so that then they would look like they were hetero, dancing. And just how revolutionary it was, even just to gather, even just to dare to be in the same space, maybe to dress in the clothes that you wanted to dress in, maybe, and I think about Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera in the Stonewall Inn in 69 and saying, you're not going to arrest me for wearing the wrong clothes. Again, these are my fucking clothes. I'm not going to let you do that. So I just think just the act of gathering has been so dangerous for queer and trans people, that to come together and dance and be in spaces of joy together is revolution, So yeah, what's not revolutionary about the dance floor? I don't know what isn't.
That's so true. People have fought for this, and as you're saying, and the work that you're doing, you've been fighting.
Yeah, and I think the sort of queer legacies of some of the house, I'm a house music head, right? So I love house music, and I think about, Frankie Knuckles, and I think about, I brought my daughter to see Frankie Knuckles at Pride when she was 8 months old. And I had her in the snuggly, and I had her with noise canceling headphones, and it was her first concert. And I was like, this is my job as a DJ parent. This is her legacy. This is part of this is part of my parenting, is that she get to experience Frankie Knuckles. And of course he died shortly after that, maybe a year or two after that. But I think about what he did and what he has meant in the places that he played, and what he how so many early house music, think about Sylvester, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, think about, Loose Joints and It's All Over My Face, and the things that they were talking about, that sort of edged on activism, or edged on queer presence or visibility, that sort of subtly are laced through all of these house music hits that we know and love, and I think about how activisty that was, and how queer, house music was, and how, there's a reason, there's this beautiful Black trans DJ, Nick Redman, who talks a lot about how house music didn't get the same sort of big up in the way that hip hop did, in part because it was so queer, and because it was so, rooted in that kind of activism. And so, yeah, I just really, I'm so thankful to some of the DJs who played in the bathhouses and who played in the queer spaces and who, were pumping out this underground house music that was telling the story of this entire generation that was, living and coming of age during the most uncertain of times, during another pandemic, right? The AIDS pandemic, and, where everything was so uncertain, and this music was keeping people coming together, and the dance floor was a space where you would come together and know that these people were still alive, because you saw them for another week, and it was an activist revolutionary thing to get to put on this music and to get to sweat it out and to get to just live it, and I came out in 1991, so I was a generation just after, but still in definitely during that pandemic height, and just thinking about houses that were created, as safe spaces for Black, Latinx, communities, the House of Extravaganza, all of these houses that are depicted in Paris as burning, and, the sort of house music that was coming out of, and Vogue music that was coming out of those communities. And, I could just wax nostalgic about it, but I mean, it's just so queer. It's so beautiful. So anyways, if you love house music, how can you not love the movement? How can you not love queer and trans people? How can you not love the revolutionary space that the dance floor was during the AIDS pandemic? How can you not love all of that? Because that's what you're listening to when you're listening to the whistle song, or when you're listening to, whatever, right? That's threaded through the music.
Totally. Yeah. You're participating. You talked about the pandemic, the AIDS pandemic, and then, we're in the pandemic right now, the COVID-19 pandemic. How has COVID-19 changed the movement in terms of the gathering and in terms of the culture that you've seen?
Well, what's interesting about the organizing now and the gathering now, of course, is because, everything is just so different. We've suddenly moved so much of our lives to this online space. And I've actually had some incredible experiences with online party spaces. When Club Quarantine first started, it was like, wow, it was so radical, and there was DJs organizing monthly sort of astrology themed parties. There were queer sex parties that were online. There were, you name it. People were coming. If you could think of it, somebody was planning it, So there was all of these like online virtual spaces for all of these communities who would otherwise maybe never have met to come together and to party together. So that's been pretty beautiful to see. And I hope that some of that lingers afterwards, because one of the things that, we have as an issue in our societies is that of a lot of our bricks and mortar kind of buildings where we gather are really inaccessible. They have steps, or the washrooms don't work for people, and then there's stuff with, getting your ID. And if you're a trans person, do you want to show the bouncer your ID? And if you're a recent migrant, do you even have ID? And there's so many reasons why coming into a party can be kind of hard. Whereas if you just do it from your living room, you can join. Anybody can join. It's very accessible. So I hope that there's some online parties that stay, so that for all of us who, the online space can be really life-giving, that there's still an option to join. So that's kind of interesting. And then I think what we're going to see more of is just how do we kind of, I think about those silent raves where people kind of all had their own music and dance at the same time. Like, if I were a predicting kind of person, I would say, imagine if we saw more of that in the future, because you could space out quite far because you don't have to worry about being close to be able to hear the sound, and you could all be kind of dancing together. So I feel like people are still going to want to gather in public. They're still going to want to gather together to party. They're not going to only want to do it online. So it's just figuring out how to do it with distancing, because from everything that I've read, it seems like we're going to be distancing for a while. So why not embrace it? Why not build it into the fun, and somehow make it part of it,
Hell yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't even considered that. The accessibility is much greater now for subgroups and subgroups and all these different types of people. You can gather in tiny clusters with the click of a link. You mentioned the point about if you're a trans person, whether you would ask yourself whether you want to show the bouncer your ID. And I never considered that. This is part of why I wanted to have these types of conversations. And it made me think about this point I was wondering about is how can you correct ignorance in your friend groups without causing conflict? Say I'm out with my peeps and somebody says or does something that doesn't align with what I know to be right. How can I correct that ignorance without sort of ostracizing the person?
We have to get better at conflict. So first of all, we have to just get better at it. Then the only way that you get better at it is by practicing it. And so if we're talking about abolition, and if we're talking about, living in a world that is less heavily reliant on police, then we're going to have to get better at dealing with conflict on our own. We're going to have to figure out ways to deal with conflict. That means that we're going to have to get better at having hard conversations. So why not start now? Why not start now having a little bit more difficult conversations with, and a perfect place to start is your peer group, because you've probably already been through some stuff together. People have stuff that happens in their lives and it kind of bonds them, and it you build trust, and you can kind of maybe go to a hard place. Maybe you can see how far you can kind of push it and see how far you can go with that person. But I think that so I think that we have to get a little bit better at dealing with conflict. But I think that there are ways that we can say to people, hey, have you thought about this? Or I was recently talking to someone and they mentioned to me, blah, blah, blah. And you get to share what it is that you know. And in a way that you're just sort of sharing the information. You're not necessarily having to make the person feel like, they're bad, because that is still using a punitive. That's not an abolitionist framework. That's a punitive. You're bad, so then therefore you have to be punished, and the punishment usually is being ostracized, right? And so we're instead saying, no. In fact, how do we share what we know, so that then that person can make a different decision in the future, And so, there are ways to invite someone into a conversation. And similarly, as we get practiced at handling conflict, we have to get better at receiving criticism and feedback from our friends, So also know that in addition to practicing doing it with your friends, when your friends come to you and say, hey, Syrus, didn't really work for me so well when you said blah, 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 I have to be able to get better at saying, yeah, I can kind of see it from your, that actually kind of sucks that I said it that way, and I hadn't really thought about it, or whatever it might, or how can I help to make this better, or whatever that needs to look like. You can kind of develop other strategies at both receiving the feedback and giving the feedback in a more productive way. I think the goal ultimately is that we are trying to build community. So we build community through taking care of each other. And so part of how we take care of each other is that if you've had the privilege of learning something, it's kind of your responsibility to share it and not just hoard that information. Share the information. So it's also like a gift that you're giving to somebody by saying, hey, did you know that trans people, often prefer that you refer to them by the genders that they're saying that they are. And that's what I do. And I think that you should do that too. Or whatever, you can kind of say it in a nice way, but there are ways that we can kind of build community by sharing the knowledge that we have, and then also by learning to take feedback. That helps us to build community.
So what you're saying is that we should be able to manage our own conflict so that it doesn't grow beyond the exchange that we're having, so that we don't need to involve security or police or mom.
Exactly.
Heaven forbid mom gets involved.
Exactly. And it's just so, we have to be, I guess, radically committed to to learning how to be in conflict with each other so that we can get through the conflict and that we can get through to the other side. And if you've ever had a conflict with a friend, like, I remember this, like misunderstandings happen. So I remember this misunderstanding that happened with a friend when I was very young. I'm 43 now, and I was maybe only in my early 20s, but I had, my friend had seen me hanging out with someone who she didn't think I should be hanging out with. And we had this disagreement about whether or not I was, or anyway, there was some disagreement that happened. And I can remember we got through it. And what happened as a result of getting through it was that our friendship was stronger because of it. And I'm sure a lot of people will have that experience, that if they've ever had a disagreement with a friend or a misunderstanding that they've successfully negotiated or worked through, you actually are a little bit closer after. Like, you can kind of handle things a bit better. I moved in with my best friend, and we lived in the same apartment for a year, and we didn't have a lot of conflict, but we ended up having a couple of things over, usual roommate stuff, the dishes or whatever, and we were stronger because of it, because we learned how to talk to each other about things that were hard, like, hey, I don't want to have to talk to you about the dishes, but could we, whatever, so we became stronger because of it. So it actually really does help you to build a deeper relationship the more that you practice getting through conflict with somebody, So not to sound like a couples therapist here, but I really do think that we could practice it, and we actually will have more community, stronger relationships because of it.
I think if we use these strategies, people can turn their party friends into real friends, and then you have community.
And the most miraculous thing will happen, because let's say that you're sitting together and you're all smoking and you're just kind of chilling as we do, and somebody says something that's like, record scratch, where you're just like, uh-oh, and if you maybe are the brave one who says, hey, let me rap at you about this for a second. Let me just, I just want to tell you this other thing, another perspective, Suddenly you have opened the door for everybody in the circle to be able to share and join in the conversation that actually could be transformative for everybody involved, right? So suddenly you've made it possible for everybody to be braver, So this idea of safe space, well, there's maybe a better idea of brave space, where you all get to be a bit braver with each other. And it's magical. It's pretty beautiful. And you'll find that you have support and allies amongst people that you didn't know. And there'll be people who maybe think very similar to you that you didn't even realize, just because you were brave enough to say something.
That's radical. Hell yeah. That's partying by example right there.
There you go. Party by example.
Yeah. This is such a great conversation. There's like 100 more questions I wanted to ask you. A quick addition to the pride. The more color, more pride flag. What are your thoughts on it? Like, does the rainbow represent all people, or is there a discussion to be had about including skin tones on the flag, or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the issue is that there is a long-standing issue of sort of white supremacy playing out in our society more generally, and of course it's replicated within queer and trans communities. And so racialized Black, Brown, Indigenous, POC, queer and trans community members have said, we don't feel that we're being reflected or represented in the queer village, for example, or in some of the queer papers, for example, or yes, in the queer flag. And so people have proposed additions. I've seen ones that have Black and brown, but that also have part of the trans flag, which is, also a group that doesn't always feel reflected by the rainbow. So I've seen beautiful flags that incorporate a variety of different communities together that are more visibility, because what Black, Brown, Indigenous, POC people are saying is, we're not seeing ourselves reflected here. We're not seeing ourselves included here. So why not adopt a flag that feels more inclusive for more people. I don't see the problem with that at all, right? And so if you're resistant to it, you have to ask yourself, what am I resisting here? Like, what's coming up for me that's making me feel that I have to hold on to something? Because it's not as if we've had rainbow flags for 5,000 years and that, early humans were tacking them up in their caves. That's not what was happening. It's a relatively recent adoption, so we could absolutely change it if we wanted to and make it something that works for more people.
That's true. Yeah, we're so resistant to change so much of the time.
Totally.
Speaking of beautiful things and beautiful artwork, your artwork features a lot of sort of future-oriented thinking and people speaking from the future to the past. And I'm wondering how the recent events of the last 6 months between protests and the movement and the pandemic, how are you now thinking about the future of equality and of peace ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, we're in this period of profound change. I teach systems thinking at the BAM Center, and one of the things that we sort of learn about through systems change work is that systems go through adaptive life cycles. They all go through these sort of figure eight infinity style adaptive change cycles, they're called, but basically it's just the life cycle of a system. And so all systems go through periods of growth and expansion, but they also go through periods of collapse and reorganization where something new starts to grow in its place. If you can imagine a forest, kind of growing tall and expansive, and then eventually, there's a forest fire or something that happens, and then new seedlings grow in the ashes. So we are in a period of systems collapse. Capitalism is collapsing. They're putting $1 trillion a day into the stock market. That is not sustainable. Absolutely not. There's, people all over the world are calling for defunding these major capitalist systems like the police system. So we're in a period of systems collapse. The COVID pandemic has created a period of systems collapse in terms of a lot of the economy and other things. So we are definitely in a moment where we are in a profound change. And this is a time when all of the seeds that we've already been planting are able to grow, and that can grow into the new society that we're hoping to live in. So I actually am in a period myself of feeling quite hopeful, because what we've been doing for the last 50 years, the last 500 years, has been planting seeds for the next society that is going to grow out of the ashes of this one. And so we are now in the point where what we're just basically doing with all of this revolutionary action is watering the plants, right? So we're watering the seeds and they're already starting to grow. So this is why we can talk about abolition in Cosmo magazine, because it is saturated everywhere, because the seeds of abolition have grown so tall that even the people who are the most unlikely are able to see them, And so we're in a period where there's sort of profound possibility, where the soil is fertile, where we're in fertile ground. So I actually feel like the future is going to be the things that we've been hoping for. It is going to be accessible. It is going to be an abolitionist future. It's going to be abolition in our lifetime. We're going to have queer and trans people living long enough to become elders, not killed down in the streets. We're going to have Indigenous resurgence and, solve the land claim issues and the land theft issues here on Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut. We're going to make sure that we live in a future where Black lives matter, because we know that if Black lives mattered, that would mean that every other life on this planet would matter, because if we made the world safer for the most marginalized, we would necessarily be making the world safer for everybody. So we will be living in a future that is vastly different than the one that we're in now, but also familiar, because it will have community, it will have parties, it will have artwork, it will have networking, it will have families, it will have park spaces, it will have forests. It will be a beautiful rendering that reminds us of the best parts of what we're living now, but without all of the policing and debt and, you know, stress because you're working yourself until you die, quite literally, just in order to pay for a meager lifestyle, you know. We won't have any of those things. We're going to be living in the most beautiful, free world where we'll all be living self-determined lives, where I can wake up in the morning and say, what the fuck do I want to do today? And that is what I'm going to do. It's going to be so good. And we are so close to there because we are actually already over the hill. If there was like a sort of a mountain that we've been trying to climb, we've been dragging a boulder, we've already crested it and we're already headed down towards the finish line. So anyways, buckle up because there's a lot of change that's going to be coming very, very fast. You know, keep the music playing while you're going through it, but we are definitely going to be sliding forward into the finish line of a much more just and a much more beautiful world any minute now. So, yeah, I'm ready for it.
I'm watching the clock.
Yeah.
It's coming.
It's coming. It's coming.
Oh, that's a beautiful future. And I share your optimism. And I think I'm curious what your advice would be. How can people start getting involved? Where can they start reading or looking or watching or listening?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great resources out there. I mean, with Black Lives Matter, we wrote a book called Until We're Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada, which you can get at any independent bookseller. You can also buy at Evil Chains, but why not support your community? And there's some great stuff in there about how to get started in organizing, a little bit about what the organizing has looked like, you know, like in the TV where they're like, if you missed the last episode, here's what you missed. So you can kind of get caught up on sort of what some of the key issues are right now that people are fighting for. There's stuff in there about mothering in the movement, being Muslim in the movement, disability in the movement, organizing online and digital organizing, art in the movement, Black and Indigenous solidarity, prison abolition. Like, it's all kind of in there. There's other great books. If you're somebody who learns from books, Robin Maynard's Policing Black Lives is so incredible and definitely a must read. Patrice Cullors' book, When They Call You a Terrorist, which is sort of like a memoir and a biography. Janet Mock's incredible book, I think it's called On Being a Woman, or My Path's a Womanhood, I can't remember, is just so beautiful. They're great resources. Tourmaline, who's a Black trans filmmaker and activist based out of the US, made a film called Happy Birthday, Marsha, which tells the story of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. So if you heard the names earlier in the broadcast and are wondering who these trans revolutionaries are, you can see Happy Birthday, Marsha online and really get a sense of, you know, just the incredible person that she was and what she gave to us as one of our ancestors that helped to birth this movement. And then there are some amazing resources online. There's a website called Everyday Abolition, which teaches you sort of how to live abolition just in your everyday life. So everything from like how you teach your kids about conflict to what to do instead of calling the police. Black Lives Matter also made a website called defundthepolice.ca, which also has alternatives to calling the police. And there's some great resources in there about just why policing is a problem and why we need change. And then I'm somebody who likes to learn also through music. So I would say check out your local DJ and hear what they're playing. I mean, I have a Mixcloud. I play a lot of activist music, but there are some incredible DJs out there. There's an Indigenous DJ named DJ Jams, Jemias DaCosta, who's always spinning incredible music. Aruna Zara, DJ Black Cat. You know, they're bringing this political music to your living room and giving you an education in that way. And then if you're somebody who likes reading scholarship and who likes sort of engaging with scholars, the Prisoners Correspondence Project, Prisoners' Rights Project has created a series of webinars all about Black liberation, abolition, and you can sort of watch them online, and there's different scholars that are talking different activists. So there's lots of different ways to find out what's going on and to get tapped in. And then I would say if you're somebody who is maybe getting a little interested, come to an event. come to a protest if you can. If you can mask up and, bring your PPE and get involved the next time that there's a big call out. It is really life-giving. You will have a blast. It is the most fun. To be surrounded by the power of the people is to really feel alive. And so, if you can, come and check out an event, because I think you'll really like it.
Beautiful. What a cornucopia you've given us here. I think we're gonna summarize everything there into the show notes so people can click through. Okay, we're getting to the end, but I have one last question. Okay, so it's Blockorama in 2070, and you can only bring 3 things to the party. What do you bring?
It's Blockorama in 2070. So obviously there's no prisons, there's no police. We've sorted that problem. Well, I am going to bring apples because I will have saved them, because they will sadly be probably a bit of a rarity because climate change, we're going to have solved climate change, but we're still going to be dealing with some of the after effects. So I'm going to bring apples because I love apples, and it's going to be and I'll be able to bring apples because we'll be reforesting and replanting our world, and it's going to be so beautiful. I'm going to bring some classical music, which will be music from the early 2000s, which will seem like Tchaikovsky or Mozart it does today, but I'll bring some, maybe the coup, maybe, party music, or I don't know, I'll have to kind of maybe some Ursula Rucker, I'm going to bring some Nicolette, some Dove song, some stuff from the crates. I'll bring some classical music. And well, I guess I probably will bring whatever the kids are doing that day. In terms of mind expanding consciousness. I enjoy mind expanding consciousness as much as the next guy. So I probably would bring whatever that was into the space.
And it wouldn't be illegal.
No, of course not. It would all be part of the medications that we have to keep ourselves alive.
Wicked. Well, Syrus Marcus Ware, it's been such a blast talking with you. Thank you for enlightening me and for everybody who's listening and watching. I think we're all more powerful for it, and I'm looking forward to watching where you're going next.
Thank you so much.
Party zone. Yeah, the party is on. In the party zone. Yeah, the party is on. In the party zone, yeah, the party is on. In the party zone, yeah, the party is on. In the party zone, yeah, the party is on. In the party zone, yeah, the party zone.